Welcome everyone to a new OSPOlogy meeting. Today's topic is about the strategy and ideas behind the OSPOlogy FOSS Fund. Before starting with the topic of the day, we will leave some minutes to share some OSPO and open source management news that has been happening during this month. And that's why right now I'm here, Ana Jimenez, by the way, program manager at Sudo Group. This is going to be like really short updates. Let's start with OSPO news. Last 2 weeks, I think it was, at KubeCon Valencia, LF Research announces the world of open source with European focus. A lot of people has been partnering for this survey, including, for instance, Open Forum Europe, the Untitled European Chapter, Code Motion, Finance, LF Public Health, Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and more organizations. So for those folks in European organizations or based in Europe, I really hope that you could take the survey, and if you know anyone that can take the survey, please feel free to share. Next week we having a panel hosted by the Linux Foundation, and this is an expert lead panel where other OSPOers will be sharing their experiences on the processes and policies they have been using to build their OSPO. This is a great opportunity to see how others has been implementing their OSPO and has been advancing in their OSPO journey. Also, for OSPOCon North America and OSPOCon Europe, we are launching the OSPO Awards. So what is that? This is for people that are engaging in an OSPO or similar open source initiative that would like to be considered a candidate. Then the To-Do Steering Committee will be reviewing these forms and vote OSPO ambassadors, and also organizations that are having an OSPO or a similar OSPO initiative can apply. This month we have OSPOCon North America, but on September and also on December we will have OSPOCon Europe and OSPOCon Japan. And for those who were saying, oh damn, I missed the call for papers for OSPOCon Europe, we have great news because we have extended until this Friday. We have a nice onboarding guides to onboard new community participants and also to get you started on To-Do resources and ways you can contribute to the To-Do GitHub organization and the different repos. A great place to start, the work days. These are monthly meetings. We have an EMEA, an APAC, and an AMER friendly time zone calls where the community gathers together to work on the different To-Do resources, such as working on To-Do guides, improving the description of OSPO roles on jobs, add content to the newsletter, add new translations, and more. I mean, one more thing. Can I contribute to OSPOlogy? How can I contribute? You can indeed contribute to OSPOlogy session and become an OSPOlogy guest. You can present a working project or finished projects that are being done at your OSPO or open source initiative. You can share your OSPO journey here. You can share OSPO or open source management tooling that work in your organization and want to share with others, or even present a proposal for a potential research or white paper. We have an OSPOlogy repo, and there you will find everything to get started. We also have a call for papers, and it's the way where people can submit their proposals. Let's move now to the topic of the month. Today we have Per, OSPO lead at Spotify, and he will be talking about the strategy and the ideas behind the new Spotify initiative, the FOSS Fund. Per, it's all yours, and good luck.
Thank you so much. Spotify has been doing open source since its very beginning, and open source is part of the different applications we distribute and part of our infrastructure, part of our tooling. And I think for the last 10 years, we've had some sort of open source group inside of Spotify that managed this topic. So it wasn't really until this year that we actually started having an actual formalized OSPO, where we also started formalizing an actual open source strategy. Part of this is like professionalizing and formalizing how we contribute and use and create open source inside of Spotify. And this strategy work resulted in a number of observations and principles that kind of led us down the road of establishing a FOSS fund. And again, also just to underline, we did not invent the concept of the FOSS fund. That there's many companies who have done it before us. So what I'll try to describe the next like 20, 25 minutes is really what are the ideas and the beliefs that we have that made us actually launch this fund, and why do we believe that this is the right thing to do. Then I also go into like the more like you can say like tactical or practical issues of doing this kind of thing, and what kind of arguments you can use in your own organization to kind of bring forward a FOSS fund in your own context. So I think I hope that you will walk away from this presentation thinking that one, it's actually not that hard to establish a FOSS fund. It's more like convincing and arguing for it. But I think my more like ulterior motive here is also to try to move the baseline a little bit for our industry, that for companies who claim that they love open source, maybe it would be good if they actually also put their money where their love is. But of course, there's obviously like a fine line between shaming and inspiring people into doing the right thing. So this is more of the inspiring than the shaming part. So anyways, just a quick note about me. So before joining Spotify, I worked in Zalando, also working with open source and security there. And before that, I spent 10 years in a bootstrap open source company where we basically experimented with like 15, 20 different income streams to kind of finance our work. When I left the company, we were nearly 70 employees and we had a community around 300,000 developers. So I know the pain that maintainers feel of like financing their work. And I've also seen it on the enterprise side of like how does sustainability impact organizations that try to consume open source. So that was the intro. So let's go into the agenda for this thing. So I'll just like start off by just giving you the extremely short version of what the FOSS fund is at Spotify. I'll just like talk more generally about what open source is as well, to give you kind of a context leading into why we choose the strategy and why we decided to include a fund in this strategy. And then some practical learnings about the setup, the executions, and then finally wrap up with like what's next actually, what's the next step for us here as well. The ultra short version of the Spotify FOSS fund is basically that we have a €100,000 budget for 2022. Our target is to fund 8 to 10 eligible projects. We have collected nominations from employees and from our dependency graph using our security team's tooling. Nominations from employees was basically just a Google form where people submitted, and we got around 60 submissions from our engineers. Our focus was very much like on small independent projects, something that was actively maintained, something we actually use and care about, and also that they were aligned with our company values. I think the last part is also that we were specifically looking for inclusive communities, people that have a code of conduct and actually have an opinion about what is a good and friendly community. And also, it made no sense for us to fund big foundations or like the Kubernetes project or CNCF, because these are already fairly well funded, and therefore our money would not make a lot of impact for these. So we were more striving for going for smaller projects where we could actually have a meaningful impact for these different things. Finally, the last choice we made was also to do this on a yearly basis instead of doing it on a monthly or quarterly basis. The reason for this is also that we have an environment at Spotify that very much strives for establishing golden paths or standard ways of doing things. So our landscape doesn't change that rapidly. It's not like we adopt a open source dependency one month and then it's everywhere the next month. So we can do this on a yearly basis, meaning that we can also set aside a bigger sum of money and give whoever we donate to a longer runway, which is more meaningful for them, because then they know they might have 10,000 euros instead of 1,000 euros to kind of move forward. So that was the rationale behind having a yearly announcement. Let's talk about open source at Spotify. So the super quick view is that we have around 230 projects on GitHub. We have a bunch of our employees on GitHub as well. And we have a lot of external contributors that has made a lot of progress to our things. On the inside, we already have like policies and processes and legalese, and we have a pretty good mindset inside the company of saying, yes, let's just open source things that make sense. We also have a bunch of projects that we feel has impact in their like various niches of the industry. Like Backstage is probably the most notable one, which is now a CNCF project, but started at Spotify. But we also have like Shio and Clio and Pedalboard and other projects as well. Let's go into the bit more like where we have challenges and what led us to this decision of a FOSS fund. So first of all, if we look at our commits across all our different projects, then over half of them actually happens outside working hours or on weekends. This is pretty much on par with the industry. There was a study in 2014 that basically said that around half of all contributions in open source communities is driven by a voluntary basis and not within working hours. It's a problem for us because we actually do want our employees to reserve time, because they should work on this in their working hours, because this should be projects that has an impact for us and it contributes to our business objectives. So we should, of course, reserve employee time to do this. This is a sustainable way forward. Our employees to also have a second job maintaining a Spotify open source project. It should be part of our normal day-to-day prioritization. That's clearly not the case right now. So the other thing is we have limited influence on our dependencies. Our security team found a list of 2,500 unique dependencies. This is just the direct ones, not like transitive ones. But we don't really have a strategy for how we are going to influence our upstream. We don't really have any involvement in like key technology driving our industry. And when we do actually do financial or non-financial support in the past, it has been down to like individual action, like someone wanted to do it and fought for it. But we didn't have like a company-wide strategy for actually how are we going to do this? And what do we actually want to get out of it? So, and the last observation from our inside is that the blue line here is number of repositories we have on GitHub. The red line is like activity in regards to like pull requests. So as you can see, we just accumulate projects over time, but our activity actually pretty much like stays the same, which is both like, it's good that we have so many things we want to put online, but at the same time, this like stagnant activity level is also that we just move from thing to thing. Like we cast our eye on the next interesting thing we want to do, and then we just leave the other things behind. So we have a problem with longevity and taking actual ownership of our projects. I think this is a fairly common pattern in the industry of companies kind of just throwing code out there to see what happens, and then if nothing happens, they move on to the next thing. So a bit like wider observations as well that also influenced our strategy here is that like Black Duck has made a audit of code bases, and they say that 88% of them contain dependencies that have not been updated in the last 2 years. Another thing, which is like we see an increased focus of security and supply chain security in the industry now, which is great. And I think it's wonderful that OpenSSF is doing this wonderful work now, and they have received a lot of money to do all these things. But also, if we look at the list of things that we as an industry want to do to raise the bar here, then we have risk assessment, code audits, creating SBOMs, scanning, incident response, and so on. And a lot of these things is going to end up on the maintainers as well. They are going to see an increased pressure, and they already are now, because now we as consumers of open source see there is an increased importance that the things we use are actually secure, but maintainers still need to do a lot of work on this. Even though all the things that OpenSSF is doing here to raise the quality of the industry, they can't go and pick like financial winners and losers. That's not the job of the OpenSSF. So maintainers need to find time and resources to do all these things we actually want to do to increase the security across the industry. And OpenSSF and the Linux Foundation can only do so much. So a lot of this will end up on the individual projects. So there'll be a raising of the bar generally for maintainers. On this, like Tidelift made a survey, like what do you hate the most about being an open source maintainer? And like half of the people there said that they didn't feel financially compensated enough for doing all this work. So again, in summary, what we have is that inside of Spotify, we kind of lack ownership. We see like a tendency of having maintainership as a secondary job. Our upstream strategy was kind of lacking. We also see like industry growing pressure on maintainers. And then we also see this, like nearly half of all maintainers don't feel compensated. So this is the different observations that's informing our strategy. Let's talk about the fund as part of our strategy to see it as a bigger whole. Our focus is to create a better sense of ownership inside of Spotify for the projects we have. Some of this work is just clearly tactical. It's just like improve our tooling and make sure there's less friction of being a maintainer. We want to have better data to actually drive if we should commit to a project, like double down, put more resources on it, or if you should actually discontinue it. We don't have that right now, but we want to know if a project is succeeding and seeing if it actually makes sense to continue doing so. And then the last part of it is to make sure that it's sustainable. That means that if a team wants to run a project, they should find like time and people to do it and dedicate it. And that also goes for the other part of it as well. Like our use of open source should also become more sustainable. We cannot save the entire world with a FOSS fund and make everything sustainable, but we want to strive for expanding this sense of ownership across the supply chain. So that's kind of the end-to-end ownership idea, that if we look at it, in the middle, we have a Spotify open source project. We have a lot of people who rely on us doing the right thing, like updating our dependencies, patching for security issues, doing migrations, doing security audits, pen testing our code, and so on and so on. But we also have the same dependency to projects that we depend on. And we basically have no influence over them doing the right thing. It's outside our control. It's not projects that we control. So this also goes into our rationale of why a FOSS fund is important, because that can actually mean that we can extend a bit of control down towards our dependencies and saying, well, we can't really control what you're doing. We're not going to give you money with strings attached, but at least we can hopefully create an environment where you have, as a maintainer, the time and the resources to actually do the right thing. And we highly depend on you doing that. So these are the different observations. And we wanted to seek out these reasons because in the end, I think everyone in the open source community agrees that it's the right thing to do to give maintainers money. But at the same time, for a lot of people outside the open source community, this is not a rationale that makes sense. Because if you just look at a normal capitalist theory, then you have a market of a seller and a buyer. And in this case here, the seller wants €0 for their products, and you as a buyer, you would be kind of dumb to pay more than that. So to kind of convince your organization and make good arguments for actually setting up a fund and paying maintainers for something that doesn't really cost anything, you have to find these good arguments. So in the end, we have a set of principles or arguments for why this actually makes sense. Like, first of all, we believe in Spotify that creators should be paid for their work. That both count for musicians, but also for open source developers. And also, we believe that you should also put your money where your mouth is, and saying, I don't think we can claim that we care about open source if you don't have a strategy for improving sustainability. Again, not said that we can solve the whole thing about sustainability, but I think we need to have a strategy for how we can at least improve parts of it, and also try to be a role model. So that's the two principles we have. And then if we go inside of our organization, we definitely have good arguments for doing this as well, besides it being the right thing to do. One is that, like, funding dependencies is an investment. It's a risk reduction investment. By funding dependencies that we have across our landscape, we can reduce the risk of this dependency becoming a security problem or becoming abandoned, lacking updates. Every time you have a change in versions, other ways in your chain, you might become incompatible and so on. We're definitely reducing the risk by giving maintainers money to actually do this work for us. That means that it gives us upstream influence, that we can actually influence these projects to set aside resources to actually do these things for us. And that goes down to, it's definitely cheaper to fund an existing dependencies than to do a costly migration to a new one. If we had a abandoned framework that we use in all of our applications and we had to migrate to something else, that would cost a lot of money in, like, developer hours, and they could spend that time in doing something much better. By investing in projects, we can hopefully secure that we don't need to migrate away from something that the maintainers walked away from. So that's the principles and the different arguments we use internally to justify that we have a FOSS fund. That's how we came here. So let's try to talk a little bit about setting up a fund. And I think this is something that's actually hard to talk about in a generic way, because this is very much about how you persuade your organization internally, how you talk to your stakeholders and so on. And I think one of the most important things is, like, how do you get the money? And I cannot really help you with that, because this is, like, down to convincing your different budget people to actually find that money for you. I gave you the arguments here that you can use of, like, risk reduction, influence, and avoid, like, these costly migrations. And I think these are the only good arguments that make sense in the business context. I will, however, try to kind of walk through, like, how the conversation went inside of Spotify with the different stakeholders that I had to talk to for you to kind of prepare on how you can convince your organization. So first stakeholder ended up being procurement. And the reason for this is that procurement generally knows how your company puts together contracts. And that is basically what a FOSS fund is. You're paying someone to deliver, well, in this case, nothing, but procurement generally knows how your company needs to put together a contract and what kind of stakeholders that needs to be consulted. Procurement might even know where you actually can find some budget for doing this, because procurement also basically knows where the money is. So think of your fund as an alternative way of paying these loosely coupled vendors. So get procurement on board, but make sure that they understand that this is not really a commercial contract. You don't need to do a big security audit, because there's no delivery, there's no support agreement, that there's no paperwork basically to be done. Then you obviously get a question from these people, is like, who are these people we want to pay? And that can be very hard to answer. So I think already here inside of the conversation inside of Spotify was very much like, well, I'll make sure we only pay people we actually know who are, so we can put, like, a name and a company on these different things. And that made, like, procurement people, like, more, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's a safer route to go. So the next step on my journey to the different teams was legal. Legal is definitely someone you need to talk to. You need them to sign off on the legality of paying third parties without a contract in place. Like, there are different mechanisms inside of a company that ensures that you can't just funnel money into a random company outside. So you definitely need legal to sign off on this process as well. I think my experience with legal is that they're generally concerned with risk and reducing said risk. And again, I think if you ask a lawyer if you should do something, then they would always say, no, let's not do it, because that's the least risky option. So you kind of need to figure out a way here to reduce the risk by outlining all the different unknowns that might be in there. One particular thing that our legal people outlined for me was that if you transfer money to someone, that could potentially be used to be seen as an endorsement or a contract or indicate employment. And that's something you have to address inside your company, how you're going to avoid that, so that legal doesn't worry about that we accidentally indicate that we are actually endorsing someone for our success. So be mindful of that and figure out a way to put together paperwork that will actually make sure that that's not the case. Using these like standardized sponsor services will definitely help you with that, because that makes the intent very clear about why you're actually transferring money to people. So, and the last stakeholder, stakeholder number 3 is tax and compliance. They will definitely have opinions about where you can send money. Generally speaking, if you are a European or North American-based company, they will definitely have a preference for staying within those regions, because that's regions where they know the banking system, they trust the banking systems, and there's all these different like due diligence mechanisms in place already where they can check where these money are going. I think for them, their preference is definitely that the fewer areas where you transfer money, the less due diligence do they need to do. And if it stays within the North American and the European market, then they have a pretty good set of controls by saying they can check the tax ID. There's these like standardized forms about checking what kind of company it is. And that will also give them some peace of mind to know that we are not trying to transfer money into India or North Korea or Russia or anywhere else where there might be people on sanctions lists, or there might be a terror group behind them. So this is the questions you're going to get. Like, how do we know that it's not a terror group that's running this JavaScript framework? So just be prepared for these questions, because this is a totally different world than they're used to, that it's a loosely coupled group of people coming together to code something. It's not something they're used to. They're used to having solid, registered commercial entities. They can look up in a registry and know exactly where they are. They can even call them on the phone or send them a fax. That's not always the case with open source projects. So I think also here in conversations with tax and compliance, was also very much like scaling down to say, okay, we'll only focus on like a known subset of the world, which tax and compliance trusts. And in this case, it was like EU and the US that made it much easier to actually have this conversation. And also the additional benefit of there is all these like trusted platforms now, such as GitHub sponsors, Open Collective, and also different payment providers. Definitely also helps, because tax and compliance knows that these platforms actually perform due diligence as well. They are Stripe, as a payment provider, is obligated to do a due diligence check to make sure you don't transfer money to someone on a sanction list. So that also will put them at ease of mind. I think finally also was that before we could transfer any money at all, we had like a clear agreement of like doing due diligence on all these items. And again, we only had 8 to 10 projects. We only do this once a year. So it's like a very much a doable thing for our tax and compliance people to look these things over and say yes or no. I think for transparency, they didn't say no for any of the projects we wanted to fund. And also it ended up being a case of actually having 8 projects that we could fund through GitHub sponsors, and 2 projects which are non-profits in the US, which makes it very easy for our compliance people to say yes or no to this thing. So I think, as I said before, I think the argument of doing this because it's the right thing to do doesn't really work in a corporate context. I think focus on being a risk reduction mechanism, creating influence, and avoiding migrations, that's an investment that makes both legal and financial sense to an organization, no matter how much they say they like open source, because the people who typically sign off on these things, they don't know what this is and why it's important. So you need to be able to explain to them in this like corporate lingo why this actually is important. Then also be ready to be flexible and compromise on what you actually wanted from the beginning. You might not be able to fund people outside of EU and the US. That's an unfortunate circumstance on like global finance at the moment, but we can only hope that these things get better. And for instance, like that Open Collective and GitHub sponsors and so on can improve in the future. So we actually do have a path towards supporting regions that's outside of the Western hemisphere. And yeah, I think in the end also, I think I can definitely recommend that you just sign up for any of these platforms that allow you to do sponsorship. It tremendously takes down the hassle of doing it, especially in regards to due diligence and advocating inside of the company for these things. So the outcome is, and we haven't announced this yet, we're going to have a blog post this week about it, but we ended up sponsoring 8 projects, and they are very much spread all over different types of projects, anything from like open source audio codecs to JavaScript frameworks to Python to test containers and so on and so on. And it's primarily based on both quantitative numbers from our dependency graph and also recommendations from our engineers. We use both methods because engineers typically know much better what tooling we use, and that doesn't show up in a dependency graph. But frameworks that we use for testing and so on do. So we have both ways to kind of determine this. So, and that also brings me to the first lesson that we learn in this. It is extremely hard to actually do a fair generic comparison across all dependencies. When you sit down as a group making this choice of who you should fund, then it's very hard to actually have a conversation about, do we fund a testing framework or a library for doing HTTP requests? It is two very different use cases. The criticality on these two things are very different. And therefore, it's very hard to actually compare how important they are to the company. The other part is that it's also, there's a big difference on how people think of the word critical inside of a company. If you ask people what's the most critical thing, then some teams will mention that very specific thing they care about, and some people will mention that we should fund Kubernetes or the Python Software Foundation. So it goes from extremely narrow to extremely wide. And so it's also a challenge to kind of find what is the important thing in the middle. Also, the 8 projects we picked, we definitely know that they're good. We definitely know that they are important to us, but we don't actually know if it was the absolute best top 8 things we could actually fund. So that's a challenge for us as well. We can definitely say it was good what we funded, and we definitely support these projects and we know they're important, but is it the best? We actually don't know. We might have overlooked something. So in the end, also, there are secondary benefits for this as well. There is a lot of awareness created inside of Spotify on why we care about open source, and showing our employees that we actually put our money in this and not just saying that we care about this as in thoughts and prayers, but actually in money, is an important conversation to have inside of the company. We do want to change the conversation from just like saying we just use open source and like it, to actually creating this mindset that it's actually okay to pay for open source because that makes sense for all of us. Also, having these conversations with the maintainers who are receiving our funds will also tie our teams together more closely with them. That's also a thing of being a sponsor, also means that you actually are put in contact with the teams who offer like one-to-one consulting and so on as well. So they also learn how we use their different projects. So what's next? Well, first of all, we need to be enabled to measure impact and value on our funds. We don't know if this is possible. We don't know if we will see any improvements on the metrics on our projects. We will try and see if it actually improves, and we can see a better performance on the maintainers for these projects compared to other ones. And there we are looking at like basic health metrics, like how long does it take to merge a pull request? Is there new releases? What is the release cadence? How long is it going from like security issue discovered to when is it fixed, and so on and so on. So we'll try to build up some metrics to see if this is actually working. The other thing we want to do going forward is to see if we can actually enable teams inside of Spotify to just do ad hoc funding. Having this conversation inside of the different legal and risk teams and so on, kind of created a path for how we can pay open source projects. So we want to investigate to see if we can actually reuse that path for teams who just want to use some of their own team budget for funding third-party providers. We don't know if that's possible, but it's definitely something we would see as an added benefit, that teams who have a dependency where they might need to pay a maintainer 500 euros to fix a bug, maybe they should just be able to take that out of the team budget, pay the maintainer, and procurement and legal and so on is already completely on board on what that means, and they won't meet this like wall of resistance because they don't understand what it is. So we want to use that path we already created for these like more ad hoc kind of funding. Then there's the selection and voting process that definitely needs work. We need to improve that. This was only the first round, so we can definitely learn and improve here. And then, of course, all these things should go into hopefully justifying a bigger budget next year. We'll see how we learn from this and what kind of benefits we can see coming from this. Again, that is also part of not just making an argument because it's the right thing to do. A organization do also want to see some outcome of investing 100,000 euros into something. And I think we should also be clear about that we should be able to justify why we spend 100,000 euros on something. So we should be able to show some sort of improvement or results in this as well. So just in summary, I think it's important that companies such as Spotify, who have the resources and therefore also a responsibility to contribute to a more sustainable industry. So if you as a company care about open source, you also need to invest in its sustainability. We really believe that FOSS funding is a risk reduction activity. That might not sound very sexy, but that is really what it is. That's why a company should engage in this as well, to reduce the risk of the different things you actually depend on. And there's no one else who's going to solve this problem for you. You might pay money to Linux Foundation, OpenSSF, and so on, but that's not going to help the different projects you specifically depend on. You need to go in and understand, like, what is your landscape, what is your dependencies, and actually help those specific projects become more sustainable. That might also be just like offering to do a security audit for them, or help them with contributions, fixing a feature, or give them money. And also looking at the greater importance of open source across the industry today, maintainers will have an increasing need of support in the future. And I think going back to my initial point in the introduction, my ulterior motive is again here to push this baseline a little bit, to say that if you as a company claim to love open source, then I think there should also be an expectation that you find ways to invest into the sustainability of open source. That was what I had. So thank you so much all for listening.